Welcome back. As we mentioned earlier, the Director of National Intelligence told the Senate Intel Committee today that although China is the biggest threat to our national security, the U.S. Intel assessment is also that Beijing wants to avoid escalating tensions with Washington. The assessment comes despite China's new foreign minister warning yesterday that unless Washington changes course, the U.S. and China are heading toward, quote, confrontation and conflict. Well, joining me now is Republican Congressman LaHood of Illinois. He's a member of the House Select Committee on China. He's also a member of the House Intel Committee. I told you, 2 committees, 1 guest. And they're going to have their own worldwide threats hearing tomorrow. So in some ways, Congressman, you get to sort of look at what the Senate did and fill in the gaps there. I could tell you one question I hope is asked, and that is sort of the level of danger in northern Mexico, which my understanding it's a pretty rough place compared to the rest of the globe these days. But let's start with China. And I thought the most startling admission was that China is looking to influence our politics and has decided if we can't influence Washington, we're going local. What do you make of that?
Well, I would say a couple things, Chuck. First of all, we have to remember China has a plan to replace the United States. And you heard Director Haynes reference this today, the challenges. But they're working economically, diplomatically, technologically, and militarily to replace the United States. Number 2, the thing that the CCP fears the most is bipartisan support against the CCP. And what's great about this new Select Committee on China, it's bipartisan. Over 100 Democrats supported it on the House floor. Look at the makeup of the committee. Republicans and Democrats that are substantive, serious, taking this committee in a very professional way. And if you watched the hearing last week in prime time, Chuck, we had tremendous witnesses, but you really couldn't tell whether a Republican or Democrat was speaking most of the time. And I really look at this as not a Republican or Democrat issue, it's an American issue. And I'm glad we have this Select Committee and looking forward to the opportunities to expose the malign activities of the CCP, but also look at significant policy solutions on helping the United States in our competition.
Do you think our economic ties are leverage are the kind of leverage that China might respond to?
Well, I think you got a couple things on that. One is when we brought China into the World Trade Organization in 2001, the argument at the time was they're going to modernize, they're going to liberalize, they're going to become more like us. Clearly that hasn't happened. And so there were mistakes made on bringing them into the global trading network, right? They've manipulated the system in many ways. To your question, this is not the Cold War with Russia because we are intertwined economically at every level with China. We have to remember that. But I do think that we can work with our like-minded allies in the Indo-Pacific region, China, Korea. They are craving our economic leadership over there, Indonesia, the Philippines. And what we ought to do is, I also serve on the Ways and Means Committee, we ought to use our trade framework to build a network of rules-based systems to isolate China. And that's frankly part of what we'll deal with on the Select Committee on China, and that will put us at an advantage.
I'm old enough to remember something called the TPP. What you're describing there, Congressman, is that was the whole supposed initial idea of the Trans-Pacific Partnership until Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump basically used it as a wedge and both parties backed away. Was that a mistake?
Well, listen, it wasn't perfect, Chuck, but it set that framework for isolating China. I think you got to take the initiative that we had with TPP and we got to change it and adapt it. Frankly, if you look at what we put in USMCA, a bipartisan trade agreement with Mexico and Canada, I think we have to look at that as a framework and figure out how we get with our like-minded allies. But to be honest with you, Chuck, the Biden administration has done nothing over the last 2 years when it comes to trade or working with our like-minded allies in the Indo-Pacific region. I think that will change with a Republican majority now, and it has to as part of our Select Committee on China.
Well, you say that assuming that somehow Republicans are more pro-free trade. They're not anymore. I mean, this seems to be a divide inside both parties these days about whether to use trade in this way, which in the past has been a very successful national security tool.
Well, you're right about that. I mean, I think the dynamics have changed, particularly as it relates to China. Are we going to let them write the rules of the road when it comes to trade in the Indo-Pacific region, or are we going to exercise our priorities? And we, frankly, haven't done that. I think we got to work with our allies in Western Europe and to other democracies and rules-based system in an economic way. And again, that's going to be a big topic, hopefully in a bipartisan way, with our Select Committee on China.
Look, I know no politician likes a hypothetical. But if our intelligence community finally gets enough information to assess that China lied to the world about COVID, right? Maybe it was naturally occurring. They studied it in a lab. It leaked out, whatever it is, but they didn't tell the truth. What should the consequences be? What are the consequences for something like that? There's one thing to pound our fist on the table, but what's the punishment?
Well, it's really a trust issue. Because remember, when COVID first broke out, remember what the Chinese said? They blamed it on the U.S. military, Chuck. That was their initial response. They did not cooperate with the World Health Organization. I would argue they've been deceitful at every level with their COVID deaths and everything else. So you cannot trust them. And, you know, we heard the Department of Energy report this week. We heard what Director Wray said on the allegations or the evidence that shows that most likely it came from Wuhan. I think there has to be consequence of that. Remember this, too, Chuck.
Would you support lawsuits? I say this, remember, that's what we did with, you had civilians sued Saudi Arabia. And then Saudi Arabia wanted to be indemnified from those lawsuits post 9/11. Would that be a way to punish China?
Well, I think that could take way too long. But again, I think you have to expose what they engaged in here, which is becoming clearer and clearer. But think about this. We had over 1 million people die in this country. How do you prevent a future pandemic when you don't know the genesis of this one? Yeah. That's the bottom line. And we need to tell everybody in the world that and expose China for what they didn't do here.
A couple of quick political things. Speaker McCarthy said he gave the January 6 footage to Tucker Carlson first for transparency purposes. Do you agree with that decision?
Well, I'm glad they were released. They should have been released. I'm all for transparency and openness. The speaker deciding who he wants to give that to is his own prerogative. But as you know, Chuck, these videos and tapes are going to go to...
It's its own prerogative. I mean, that's not the definition of transparency in this case.
Well, we can quarrel about who you give it to first, but everybody's going to have access to these tapes and what happened. But I would say this. Obviously, there were over 125 police officers that were injured and hurt as part of 9/11. I'm sorry, as part of January 6th. And I've said that was a terrible day for democracy. But I'm glad they were released.
Do you agree with the Capitol Police Chief who said called Tucker Carlson's broadcast offensive and misleading?
Well, I'm not going to get into what somebody else said about somebody else. I wasn't a part of that. I'm glad they're being released. We need more transparency in this process.
Did you think January 6th was a violent attack?
Listen, I publicly said at the time that it was a terrible day for our democracy, a black eye on our system of government, and we ought to learn from it.
Congressman Darren LaHood, as I